Greetings and welcome to the United States Transhumanist Party Virtual Enlightenment Salon. My name is Gennady Stolyarov II, and I am the chairman of the U.S. Transhumanist Party. Here we hold conversations with some of the world's leading thinkers in longevity, science, technology, philosophy, and politics. Like the philosophers of the Age of Enlightenment, we aim to connect every field of human endeavor and arrive at new insights to achieve longer lives, greater rationality, and the progress of our civilization.
Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. I was quite saddened on October 5th to learn of the death at age 56 of Steve Jobs, the founder and CEO of Apple, as well as the founder of Pixar. He was certainly a brilliant and highly creative entrepreneur who brought to the world many products that millions of consumers throughout the world enjoy. And while Apple is not my favorite company, Apple's products are not my favorite products in terms of either personal computers or MP3 players, I think that this man's presence in the world, his activities, his ideals and aspirations made the world a better place. So it is quite saddening that he has died at such a young age, and that essentially a vacuum has formed, and his creative energy, his ideas for how to make products, how to improve products, how to improve the lives of consumers, that vacuum is not going to be filled, at least not right away. Now, Steve Jobs, in my view, had his virtues and he had his failings. And with regard to his virtues, I think those are quite obvious. With regard to his failings, he has been rightly criticized for maintaining a culture of extreme secrecy and micromanagement at Apple, as well as for trying to sue his competition out of existence via the use and abuse of intellectual property laws. Whatever one might think of the validity of those laws, it seems quite unjustified what Apple has been trying to do to its competitors in the smartphone market, trying to sue the Android phone manufacturers out of existence. So definitely a mixed character, and I think also a mixed character in his philosophical views. My focus today will be on remarks from his 2005 commencement address at Stanford University. In this address, Steve Jobs presented a mixture of ideas that are highly stimulating and inspiring, but also ideas that, to someone like me, who is an advocate of individualism and technological progress and indefinite human life extension, are quite frustrating, because I think Steve Jobs made many elementary errors during the latter third of his address when he was discussing death. Steve Jobs' philosophy on death, I think, is all too typical today. It is a philosophy of accepting the inevitability of death and even finding a great deal of merit and desirability in the occurrence of death. So I will go through Jobs' remarks one at a time and identify what I consider to be the crucial flaws in what he is saying. And it's unfortunate because were it not for those remarks, his speech would be excellent and quite motivating to the next generation of entrepreneurs, including entrepreneurs who I think have an extremely high potential, not a certainty, but at the very least a high potential of solving this terrible problem of human mortality, an upper limit on the human lifespan that we unfortunately experience today. Jobs starts his discussion on death with a quotation: "If you live each day as if it were your last, someday you'll most certainly be right." And he continues by saying that during his life he asked himself every day, if today were the last day of my life, would I want to do what I'm about to do today? And he says, whenever the answer has been no for too many days in a row, I know I need to change something. My response to this is threefold. First of all, much human accomplishment involves long-term planning, not only over the course of days, but over the course of months, years, and decades. To start a project that changes the world, as Steve Jobs certainly has done with the many technologies that he brought us, it would seem quite imprudent to adopt a short-term attitude, living each day as if it were one's last. Because if there's this terminal horizon at the end of the day, then one would be motivated to only seek a very short-term gain, whatever will pay off today, whatever will bring one immediate enjoyment today, whatever one can enjoy in the present moment, essentially, or a few minutes from now, a few hours from now, until the day ends. And this is, of course, the exact opposite of a long-term oriented attitude, where sometimes today one might accept having to endure certain suboptimalities or certain frustrations if those are instrumental in achieving a longer-term benefit, a longer-term objective. So it seems that in terms of innovation, the desirable attitude is to look far into the future, farther into the future than most people wish to look or perhaps dare to look, because the world will look very different in the future, and a lot of people are fearful of contemplating significant deviations from the status quo. To look into the future and to plan in that very uncertain future, to take steps today that might not be in themselves immediately pleasant, but will involve significant payoffs later on, that, I think, is the essence of innovation. And implicitly, Steve Jobs has been doing that. It seems that his explicit philosophy here was in conflict with the actions he took as the founder of multiple businesses, the developer of many products that took years, and the collaborative work of hundreds of people to bring to fruition. Second, if the point of his statement is to enjoy life in the present, I do not disagree. I think it's desirable to enjoy what one is doing even if it's not physically pleasant, or even if it's not gripping or exciting right in the present moment. Perhaps the recognition that what one is doing for the future is going to really create some amazing benefits can be a motivating force, can be something that emotionally and intellectually keeps one enjoying the present moment, even if one's tasks at the present moment might be tedious or repetitive or uninteresting in some way or another. I think it's still good to enjoy doing that if it has a real meaningful purpose and will pay off later on. But that does not require the threat of an impending death or an eventual death of any sort. It just requires reason. It requires understanding why you're doing what you're doing and what the benefits of that are going to be. It requires a very calm, rational, down-to-earth attitude, and one's own annihilation doesn't need to come into the picture. It's as if to enjoy the visual world, to enjoy all of the colors and textures and shapes that occur in many varieties all around us, one had to somehow conceive of the possibility or the inevitability of one's vision eventually being extinguished. It's as if you can't enjoy the visual world properly unless you thought that sometime in the undefined future someone was inevitably going to pour acid into your eyes and render you blind. I disagree with that. The threat of losing one's vision, or the inevitability of losing one's vision, has nothing to do with enjoying sight. Sight is enjoyable in and of itself, or it's enjoyable as an instrumental means to some other end. But the loss of X does not make X more valuable. And third, with regard to that point, why the defeatist attitude toward death? Why assume that everyone inevitably is going to die just because this has happened in the past? It seems to automatically discount the possibility of technological progress and the possibility of human innovation getting us to a point where we actually defeat this peril. It presupposes something that really would need to be rigorously demonstrated, and to rigorously demonstrate an impossibility is close to impossible. Not impossible in all cases, not impossible from the standpoint of using a logical argument to rule out something that's self-contradictory, but from the standpoint of demonstrating an empirical impossibility with regard to what humans will be able to accomplish in the future, that is, at the very least, extremely difficult, and Jobs has not done the work to demonstrate that impossibility. He has just assumed it. Jobs said, "Remembering that I'll be dead soon is the most important tool I've ever encountered to help me make the big choices in life. Because almost everything, all external expectations, all pride, all fear of embarrassment or failure, these things just fall away in the face of death, leaving only what is truly important." And here, we really have to confront what death actually does. Death doesn't just eradicate one's embarrassments and fears and irrational trepidations. Death leaves nothing. It spares neither the important nor the unimportant. It is absolute non-existence. It's the eradication of the individual. It's nothingness. For oneself, from one's own perspective, if one dies, nothing survives. Not one's fears or failings, but also not one's accomplishments or virtues. Those die with oneself as well, along with one's memories of what one's life had been. So it seems like Jobs was being quite selective in what he emphasized in terms of death sweeping away. Yes, death does sweep away insecurities and fears, because one can't experience those either, but I would rather experience insecurities and fears than nothing at all. If that were the choice, to exist in a fearful state or to not exist as an individual at all, I would choose the most fearful existence possible. Of course, having an existence devoid of irrational fears is better than having an existence with irrational fears, but again, eradicating those irrational fears does not involve accepting one's mortality or glorifying it in some way. And it seems to me that I could turn around this question and ask, why strive for anything? Why try to accomplish anything if everything will be obliterated from one's own perspective at the very least? And asking that question does not make one a nihilist, because I think a coherent answer, a life-affirming answer, is possible. The answer is, it's the struggle against death, not the acceptance of death, that can confer genuine hope and motivation. The fact is, we are alive right now, and we should strive to do everything possible to prolong that, to enhance that, to increase both the duration and the quality of our lives. And this is what enables our activities to be meaningful. This is what justifies our striving and accomplishment and attempts at self-improvement. Not thinking, oh, I'll be wiped out someday, so I'd better make the most of my time right now, but rather, I have this existence, I want to preserve it, I want to hold on to it as long as possible, and I want to make it as enjoyable as possible, and whether or not I will die eventually, neither of those is guaranteed, but I am going to fight for my life. I am going to fight for my life no matter what the circumstances are, no matter where I start out, and no matter what my condition eventually becomes. That's what is truly motivating. That is what really justifies human striving. Jobs continues by saying, "Remembering that you are going to die is the best way I know to avoid the trap of thinking you have something to lose." And I respond, well, clearly, no, you have your life to lose. And that's the most significant loss. What happened to Steve Jobs was the most significant loss for him. There could not have been a greater loss. And of course, it was also a loss for the rest of us, because a great innovator has perished. But it isn't nothing. Indeed, there are many decisions that an individual could make in the course of life that significantly increase the probability of loss of life, even if that's not what one is after when one is making those decisions. But clearly, if everything else depends on one's being alive, then those decisions that increase the probability of the loss of life are those that should be avoided the most. And it's true that many people are held back from accomplishing what they want, and indeed what would be best for them, due to irrational fears. I think Jobs takes entirely the wrong approach in emphasizing acceptance of death as the way to overcome those irrational fears. Overcoming the fears should have nothing to do with perceiving death as inevitable. Rather, one needs to simply use reason to evaluate the facts of reality, and then to act on the conclusions of one's reason. What is it that one is afraid of? What is it other than one's life that one has to lose? What could one gain? What is the upside of making a decision as well as the downside? How can one weigh the benefits versus the costs of a decision in a manner that, at least as an approximation, makes sense and can serve as a guide to the next steps that one will take? Once again, it's a very calculated, down-to-earth kind of approach. It doesn't require thinking of one's own obliteration. Jobs, back in 2005, spoke of his pancreatic cancer, and he said it was the closest thing I'd been to facing death, and I hope it's the closest I get for a few more decades. And again, it's very sad that this did not come true, that he did not live a few more decades. But it's an interesting question as to why he established that time frame of a few more decades with regard to when he would want to face this issue again, or at least this was the time frame for which he wanted to delay facing this issue. He was in his early 50s when he made that address, and he would be in his early 80s or 90s in a few more decades. And one aspect of this is cultural conditioning. In our time and culture, it's considered a fruitful, fulfilling, long life if one has lived into one's 80s or 90s. Now, this was not always that way. Those same considerations were made in the Middle Ages with respect to someone who had lived into his 50s or 60s. Indeed, Steve Jobs, if he had died in the year 1500, would have been considered to have lived quite a long life. He would have been considered to have been an old man, indeed an old man for about 2 decades prior to his death. So a lot of people would have just said, well, it's natural that someone died at 56. However, societal attitudes and expectations have changed because technology has improved and has been able to enhance the average human life expectancy. Now, Jobs' death at the age of 56 is seen as a tragedy, and Jobs himself undoubtedly saw it as a tragedy. He did not want to die. And it seems to me that pushing this problem back a few decades is a long enough margin of time for the idea of death to become a mere idea again, just an intellectual concept which one could rationalize into everyday existence, something that's a background presence but doesn't directly affect oneself yet. So it's easier to accept death then than if it's an urgent, pressing reality that could happen any day. Of course, no one, except seriously disturbed individuals, would like to die tomorrow. Steve Jobs did not want to die the next day. He did not want to die when he did. This is indeed the reason why Aubrey de Grey focuses so much on extension of youthful life and eradication of the diseases of old age. He asks the question of, if you are young and healthy right now, would you want to die tomorrow? And clearly the answer is no. So if you ask that question every day, and every day you stay relatively young and healthy, then your answer as to whether you would want to die tomorrow will be no, irrespective of whether that question is asked 5 months from now or 100 years from now, as long as you stay youthful and your quality of life remains high. And I think that was the same for Steve Jobs. And Jobs did say, no one wants to die. Even people who want to go to heaven don't want to die to get there. And yet death is the destination we all share. Again, the idea of death as being inevitable, inescapable, which is something that Jobs seems to presuppose without really presenting evidence for it. He does say no one has ever escaped it, but again, just because something has not been done in the past does not necessarily mean it will not be done in the future under different conditions. But here is where Jobs presents his normative view of death, which I think is the greatest problem with his remarks. He says, and that is as it should be, because death is very likely the single best invention of life. It's life's change agent. It clears out the old to make way for the new. Now, this is an idea that one encounters all too frequently. My first response is, why assume that the old and new cannot coexist? Indeed, this would be quite a cruel way to introduce change, to kill sentient, rational beings, and indeed millions and eventually billions of them needlessly so. Wouldn't it be the case that if what one values is beneficial change, progress, then more diversity, more mutually beneficial interaction, more exchange of ideas can occur if more people from more generations are alive, youthful, and working at the same time? Wouldn't it be great, for instance, if Steve Jobs and Leonardo da Vinci and Isaac Newton and some inventor from the early 22nd century could all sit together and share ideas about how to invent technologies or how to conduct scientific research? Wouldn't it be amazing what these great minds of the past and the future, if they were gathered together, could accomplish? Maybe they would even disagree with each other and have heated arguments, but out of those heated arguments would come the identification of crucial issues and multiple different approaches that different people would try in competition with one another to get at the best result. Second, Jobs' argument implies that death is teleologically beneficial, that it's some great cosmic blessing, as opposed to just an accident of nature caused by the breakdown of a complex system. My view is much like a computer or an iPod might break down. Living organisms break down too. And it's for the same essential reasons. Something failed. Some component failed. The interaction of the components was no longer sustainable in a beneficial manner, either because of some flaw within the system or the introduction of some external harm-causing agent. As an atheist, a philosophical materialist, and a rationalist, I cannot accept that if terrible things happen to good people, this must somehow be part of a cosmic greater good. That seems to me to be the Panglossian fallacy of what is right, a fallacy that Voltaire exposed quite thoroughly and with a lot of biting satire in Candide. To me, death is a failure. And it's a failure that is preventable with enough knowledge and technology. Just as today, if one maintains one's house, or maintains one's car, or maintains one's computer, one can at the very least greatly extend their longevity. Some cars and houses have been maintained in good condition for nearly a century. Death is tragic, precisely because it's pointless, and it has no benefits that could come anywhere nearly to compensating for the cost. Think about this. If an individual dies, that is an entire universe extinguished, an entire internal world of experiences, memories, ideas, aspirations that can never again be replicated. And what's the benefit, according to Mr. Jobs? It's change. It's sweeping out the old to make way for the new. Maybe a little bit more innovation, though I don't buy that. I don't think that justifies the tremendous costs of obliterating an entire universe. Indeed, 150,000 of those universes every day. Third, Jobs' argument implies that irrespective of whether we want to live, it is justified for us to be killed off against our will, to be, in his words, swept away in order for something new to replace us. To an individualist who considers the individual to be of the utmost moral value, this ultimate compulsion, this ultimate deprivation of life, should be abhorrent. And fourth, who says the new is necessarily better than the old? Who says that what is swept away is inferior to what will replace it? I agree that we should seek progress, which is beneficial change, but not just change for its own sake. And with regard to death, it doesn't matter whether you're an innovator or a Luddite. It doesn't matter whether you are a virtuous person or an evil person. In the present state of our ignorance, death will take both the good and the bad. Death will take both those who could have improved the world and those who could have caused harm if they had remained alive. So, Jobs' argument simply doesn't stand up if what he wants to say is that death is an agent of progress. He's right to say that death is an agent of change per se, but why should we assume that that change is beneficial change? I certainly don't see that as being the case. Finally, with regard to this segment of his remarks, Jobs says, "Your time is limited, so don't waste it living someone else's life. Don't be trapped by dogma, which is living with the results of other people's thinking. Don't let the noise of others' opinions drown out your own inner voice. And most important, have the courage to follow your heart and intuition." To this I respond that I'm sympathetic with a lot of what he is saying here. I also agree that it's important to eschew blind conformity and dogma, but the reason to do so is not because one's time is limited, but because one hopes for something better than the standard paths and outcomes that one sees in the world around oneself. It's ambition for the future, the desire to create a better life, not the urgency of death, that results in innovation and aspiration. I think implicitly, many of us grasp this. Implicitly, Steve Jobs tried to lead a good life. He did not always make good decisions, but he made enough good decisions to leave a positive mark on the world. Unfortunately, the explicit acceptance of death, indeed the attempt to justify death as somehow cosmically beneficial, is a trap that Mr. Jobs fell into, just like millions, if not billions, of other people fall into, because while implicitly and through their everyday decisions they do accept life and try to improve their situation, try to plan for the future, try to create something good in the world, they do live with this specter of their own demise. And they have a choice with regard to how to face that. Either they try to combat it, which is hard, in which case they'd have to recognize what a terrible obstacle it is, and what a terrible age of barbarism we live in, that this problem has not yet been solved. Or else they could try to rationalize it away and give their everyday lives a kind of feeling of fundamental cosmic peace, if one could put it that way, because they think all is right with existence, with what some might call the cycle of life, of birth and death, whereas in fact it isn't. But by convincing themselves that it is, they could focus more on the routine aspects of life without combating and confronting that great peril. But I think it ought to be combated and confronted. It's a great tragedy what happens to 150,000 people every day. It's a great tragedy what happened to Steve Jobs, because his internal universe was also extinguished. And I wish it hadn't been. I wish that the advances that will come in the future would not have come too late for Steve Jobs. Because certainly we could have benefited from his innovation and his creativity for an indefinite amount of time longer. Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. I was recently asked to respond to a challenge to one of the fundamental ethical premises that I hold. That premise is that for an innocent individual, continued life in any state, even a very bad state, is more desirable than death. As to what constitutes an innocent individual, definitions may vary, but I would venture to say that almost all of you in my audience today would qualify, if not all of you. So the challenge to my viewpoint here is a scenario akin to the World Trade Center bombing, where many of the victims chose to jump to their deaths from 90 stories instead of perishing in a blazing inferno. And the essence of the challenge is, if there is this situation where one might artificially hasten the arrival of one's death by a few seconds or a few minutes in order to avoid a much more gruesome death, then would it be legitimate to do so here? And I have several responses to that kind of challenge. First, as a more general response, I would refer the audience to Ayn Rand's essay, The Ethics of Emergencies, which states that extraordinary situations, emergency situations, where a lot is at stake within a very short period of time, or where there is such extreme scarcity of resources that it seems, and here's the key term, it seems that one can't get out of that situation without somebody's life being lost or being sacrificed, the so-called lifeboat scenarios. Those should not serve as general ethical guides, because fundamentally the purpose of ethics is to guide individuals in everyday life, in everyday decisions. And in the vast majority of contexts, while some people do meet unfortunate fates in natural disasters or man-made disasters, those kinds of constraints do not exist. So in terms of general ethical principles, those ethical principles need to be applicable to everyday life. And even if some exceptions are admitted in emergency circumstances, those exceptions do not override the ethical principles that apply on an everyday basis. So if on an everyday basis, continued life is more desirable than the death of the individual, if on an everyday basis it is never justified to sacrifice one individual's life, one innocent individual's life, to save another, then that is still a general ethical principle that still remains just as valid in terms of everyday well-considered decision-making that the overwhelming majority of ethics would address. But I would go further than that. I would go further than Ayn Rand went and actually look at the emergency circumstances themselves. And even in the emergency circumstances, I would argue that it is never justified to artificially hasten either one's own death or the death of an innocent other individual. And here is how I would make that argument. I would bring in the fact that human beings' knowledge about the future outcomes of any such event is inherently extremely limited, particularly if it's an emergency, particularly if it is something that has struck very suddenly and without warning, such as the World Trade Center attacks. Hindsight is very accurate regarding what happened. However, from the vantage point of someone who is experiencing that event, very little is certain. They don't know exactly what occurred from what source, how much damage was inflicted, what the likely future of that building is going to be, what the reasonable likelihood of escape would be, and to be sure, many of these victims did try to escape and did their best and did not make it. So even the best intentions in that kind of emergency situation wouldn't necessarily result in the best outcome. And this is not something that ethics requires. Ethics does not require every action or every attempt by an individual at an action to be successful or to actually fulfill the chosen goal. That would be very good, that would be very desirable, but human beings are limited. And within those limitations, human beings can make mistakes. Sometimes mistakes that end up suggesting that the course of action made with the best intentions was quite counterproductive. Still, from the vantage point of someone in that situation, it's not at all clear that jumping to one's death is the only way to avoid a gruesome death in a blazing inferno. There could be, at least from that vantage point, many other outcomes to that. One outcome could be that the building damage really isn't all that great, and it would be possible either to save the building or at least for the people in it to escape in time. Another possible outcome is there could be some sort of rescue that is effected. It didn't happen in the World Trade Center situation, but it could happen in another situation where some of the other facts are different. To jump to one's death is to make an assumption that the outcome is certain in the future, that there's no way to avoid death. And I would say that assumption cannot be made even if it looks like the probable outcome. Even if it looks very probable that no matter what one does, one will not be able to escape. Because probability is also a function of the information that one has. Probability isn't some objective fact that exists out there. Probability is very much based on the subjective perception of the individual. What the individual knows and what the individual doesn't know, what the individual is uncertain about. Probability is essentially an attempt to gauge how much uncertainty exists and what the likelihood of various outcomes is given that uncertainty. If you knew, for instance, every minute physical force that was acting on a coin as it was tossed up in the air, it would no longer be a 50% probability of heads on that coin and a 50% probability of tails. That 50-50 guess is just what you're able to determine based on the best information available to you, which is really pretty limited. And so it is with every other event. And in an event of extreme uncertainty, such as a natural disaster or a man-made disaster like the World Trade Center bombings, there's not much that can be known. And so, while one should try to save oneself, one should try to act on one's best probabilistic estimate of the situation, even if it's a very rough estimate. It is not justified to give up, because giving up assumes certainty of knowledge. It assumes the certainty of knowing that nothing good can possibly happen, or that nothing can save oneself. And I think that insight can be generalized to other ethical situations in emergency situations. So, for instance, with the lifeboat scenarios, what happens in that kind of scenario? It's typically posited this way. You're out in the middle of an ocean, there's been a shipwreck, and say there are 2 people in the lifeboat, and you estimate that there are only enough supplies for 1 person. So what do? And the insinuation here is the noble moral thing would be to jump overboard and let the other person have the supplies. I disagree with that. Again, uncertainty is a big part of the picture. What if you estimate that you will be out on the ocean for 14 days, but really after 7 days, a helicopter appears and rescues the 2 of you? If you had plunged to your death, then you would have missed out on that possibility of rescue. On the other hand, if you had taken the opposite course of action and, for instance, cannibalized on the other person or sacrificed the other person, then you would legitimately be found guilty of murder, and besides, you would have destroyed an innocent life. So neither of those courses of action is desirable. In that kind of situation where there's limited knowledge, there may be a lot of survival pressure, but also a lot of uncertainty. The correct course of action is always to try to survive, try to save yourself without harming innocent other people, and hold out for hope. So I think that insight reaffirms my premise that for an innocent individual, whether it's you or someone else, continued life is always more desirable than death, than either sacrificing yourself or sacrificing other people. As a libertarian and individualist, I am thoroughly opposed to the inherently unjust killing of any innocent person. Yet war, organized, armed conflict, unavoidably causes the suffering, maiming, and deaths of innocents. I have argued in my videos, A Complete Denunciation of War and Refuting Ayn Rand on War, that whatever the ostensible abstract aims any war might have, the end result is always the concrete suffering of those who deserve it least. The innocent victims, for whom the injustices that brought about that war, such as an oppressive dictatorship, are compounded by the destruction and carnage inflicted by the war itself. The human and economic tolls of war are alone enough to fully justify a complete opposition. But there is a further reason to oppose wars among human beings. They distract us from the real war that we should all be fighting, against the real enemy that threatens us all. By killing and injuring one another, by destroying the property and infrastructure on which our fellow humans rely, we only clear the way for our mutual enemy to destroy every one of us. It is difficult to find a single name by which to refer to this mutual enemy, for it consists of many elements with distinct modes of operation. Yet the result of each of these modes is the same, our destruction. While this enemy is difficult to name, it is not difficult to identify in our daily lives. War among humans is just one of the ways in which the real enemy manifests itself. The cousins of war, murder, theft, rape, political oppression, and plain destructive inanity of a million petty sorts, are ongoing even during times of ostensible peace. But the real enemy's tactics are not so limited as to rely on destruction inflicted by men alone. Myriad diseases afflict humans, diseases of infection, internal breakdown, senescence, and self-inflicted folly. Natural disasters, earthquakes, hurricanes, tornadoes, wildfires, blizzards, volcanoes, and tsunamis inflict colossal damage so often that news of some such calamity occurring somewhere in the world are almost uninterrupted. And then there are the grave existential threats to all humankind. The possibility of a massive asteroid striking the Earth and obliterating most higher-order life forms. The possibility of a new ice age, imperiling agricultural production and dramatically shrinking the range of habitable land. The possibility of a major epidemic, akin to the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918, killing hundreds of millions of people or more. And in the face of the tremendous damage and threats from all of these perils, what do humans do? They turn on each other and amplify the damage over petty geopolitical and ideological quarrels? How bizarre and absurd. And even in eras where by a stroke of luck, some humans in some parts of the world enjoy a welcome reprieve from some or even many of these perils, the real enemy manifests itself in more mundane ways. Machines tend to break down, structures tend to break, information tends to be forgotten, lost, or destroyed, food tends to rot and spoil, humans and their animal companions tend to senesce and die, unless something is done about it. In my essay, Progress, Creation, and Maintenance, I explained that human creation and creativity are not sufficient for civilization to flourish and advance. We must also preserve and maintain what has been created in the past. or else we shall return to using our unaided minds and bodies against the full range of horrifying perils that surrounded our primeval ancestors. What is this enemy? While it works in ways that are both sudden and gradual, manifest and insidious, broad and targeted, perhaps the best name for it is ruin. The forces of ruin are the forces of death and decay. They are the many processes by which living organisms and their creations, in their beautiful and immense sophistication, are erased and decomposed, dissolved into the jumble of primitive elements whence they arose. For everything that aspires to be higher and greater, the forces of ruin act to bring it down to rot in the earth. Everything that is built, grown, and nurtured, the forces of ruin threaten to weaken, diminish, crush, and demolish. Wherever and whoever you are, whatever means are at your disposal, the forces of ruin are targeting you, using any vulnerability they can exploit. Will you acquiesce to your annihilation? Or will you resist and strive to win back the ground that ruin has conquered and to defend what it has not yet despoiled? Each human being possesses an intellect that can be harnessed as a weapon of immense power in the war on ruin. Technology and reason are the two products of the intellect which can be deployed as tactics and strategies and win battles against the forces of ruin. Over the long, arduous ascent of man, some of these destructive forces have already been diminished or even eradicated altogether. Smallpox, typhus, and polio are among the minions of ruin that humankind has vanquished. Humans are making gradual but significant inroads against crime, diseases, and even human war itself on many fronts, but the present rate of advancement will not be enough to save us, rather than some remote descendants of ours, from ruin. To save ourselves, we will need to greatly accelerate our rate of technological and moral progress. To do this, we will need to think more creatively than ever before, utilizing all of the hitherto discovered valid technological, economic, political, ethical, and aesthetic insights at our disposal, and launch a multifaceted bombardment of human ingenuity to eradicate one peril after another. This program cannot be centrally planned or coordinated. It requires the independent, highly motivated action of millions, and hopefully billions, of autonomous human intellects, each willing to wage a guerrilla war against the forces that have held all of us and our ancestors as their slaves and pawns since time immemorial. To embrace the challenge in all of its urgency, enough of us need to be free to do so, unbound by the constraints imposed by other men who think they know better, and who would wish to keep us in line to serve their momentary interests, rather than the paramount interests of our own perpetuation. Those who wish to impose their vision of the good life through regimentation upon the rest of us overlook the vital fact that with human independence and creativity thus shackled, entire societies have become sitting ducks, waiting for the forces of ruin to sweep away static, inflexible, primitively engineered communities of men. Only the liberty of each of us to act and innovate can lead to a sufficient variety and intensity of ideas and approaches as to keep ruin at bay. Ruin is deadly serious, but it receives precious little human attention. It is the proverbial elephant in the room, except unlike an elephant, far more vicious and deadly, which most people have been culturally taught to ignore, so as to maintain comfort and a more immediate focus, so as not to let massive threats interfere with their everyday pursuits. During most of human history, this enemy was so powerful that humans had no real chance against it, and their religions, philosophies, and social norms evolved to teach them that they might as well not try. They might, like the Stoics, decide to accept their inevitable destruction with grace and equanimity. Or they might, like the Christians, convince themselves that their destruction would not be ultimate, and that they would persevere in another form. In practice, these invented consolations serve to capitulate our ancestors to the enemy. We can forgive our ancestors for devising these coping mechanisms in the absence of any real hope. But we cannot forgive ourselves if we, in our more advanced technological and intellectual condition, abandon the fight only because our inherited norms suggest it to be useless to begin with, or even undesirable to pursue. There are many perils that each of us can choose to confront, and many tactics that we can begin to actualize. One size does not fit all, and the struggle against ruin should be waged by each individual, unleashing his or her strengths in the area where he or she thinks them to have the greatest impact. But a good beginning would be to stop undermining and destroying one another. The pettiness and absurdity of human wars in both their causes and in their methods, as if men with guns on a field somewhere or explosives dropped from the sky onto a city would ever solve any serious problem in any meaningful way, would be laughable if it were not so tragic in its toll. The same goes for the intellectual, economic, and political straitjackets that humans in virtually every society create for themselves, artificially restraining meaningful exploration of ways to conquer ruin instead of just succumbing to it in a structured fashion, with a privileged few at the top maintaining the illusion of control. An anthill, after all, is powerless before the magnifying glass and the rays of the sun, no matter how much absolute power the ant queen perceives herself to have over her minions. We must be more than ants to win this war. We must all be individuals and recognize each of our individual lives as sacrosanct. We must direct all of our anger and hatred not toward other men, but toward the menace of ruin. The more of us do this now, the greater our likelihood of winning not just some remote, bright future for our descendants, but our very lives from the ravages of senescence, disease, and calamity. I can imagine no greater victory or more glorious objective. The spoils of any interhuman war are supremely uninspiring and meritless by comparison.
Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. A major benefit of longer lifespans is the cultivation of a wide array of virtues. Prudence and forethought are among the salutary attributes that the lengthening of human life expectancies, hopefully to the point of eliminating any fixed upper bound, would bring about. Living longer renders people more hesitant to risk their lives, for the simple reason that they have many more years to lose than their less technologically endowed ancestors. This is not science fiction or mere speculation. We see it already. In the Western world, average life expectancies increased from the 20s and 30s in the Middle Ages, to the early 30s circa 1800, to the late 40s circa 1900, to the late 70s and early 80s in our time. As Steven Pinker writes in his magnum opus, The Better Angels of Our Nature, the overall trend in the Western world, in spite of temporary spikes of conflict such as the World Wars, has been toward greater peace and increased reluctance of individuals to throw their lives away in armed struggles for geopolitical gain. Long-term declines in crime rates, automobile fatalities, and even smoking have accompanied and contributed to rises in life expectancy. Economic growth and improvements in the technologies of production help as well. If a person has not only life but material comfort to lose, this amplifies the reluctance to undertake physical risks even further. Yet, with today's finite lifespans, most individuals still find a non-negligible degree of life-threatening risk in their day-to-day endeavors to be an unavoidable necessity. Most people in the United States need to drive automobiles to get to work, in spite of the risk of sharing the road with incompetent, intoxicated, or intimidating other drivers. Over 30,000 people perish every year in the United States alone as a result of that decision. While the probability for any given individual of dying in an automobile accident is around 11 in 100,000, or 0.011% per year, this is still unacceptably high. How would a person with several centuries, several millennia, or all time ahead of him feel about this probability? Over a very long time, the probability of not encountering such a relatively rare event asymptotically approaches zero. For instance, at today's rate of U.S. automobile fatalities,
A person living 10,000 years would have a probability of 0.3329, a mere 33.29% likelihood of not dying in an automobile accident. If you knew that a problem in this world had a 2/3 probability of killing you eventually, would you not want to do something about it? Of course, the probabilities of tragic events are not fixed or immutable. They can be greatly affected by individual choices, our first line of defense against life-threatening risks. Well-known risk management strategies for reducing the likelihood of any damaging event include 1. Avoidance, not pursuing the activity that could cause the loss, for instance, not driving on a rugged mountain road, but this is not an option in many cases. 2. Loss prevention, undertaking measures such as driving defensively that allow one to engage in the activity while lowering the likelihood of catastrophic failure. And 3. Loss reduction, undertaking measures such as wearing seatbelts or driving in safer vehicles that would lower the amount of harm in the event of a damaging incident. Individual choices, of course, cannot prevent all harms. The more fundamental defense against life-threatening activities is technology. Driving itself could be made safer by replacing human operators whose poor decisions cause over 90% of all accidents with autonomous vehicles, early versions of which are currently being tested by multiple companies worldwide and have not caused a single accident to date when not manually driven. Today, forward-thinking technology companies such as Google are driving the autonomous vehicle revolution ahead. There is, unfortunately, no large clamor by the public for these life-saving cars yet. However, as life expectancies lengthen, that clamor will surely be heard. When we live for centuries and then for millennia, we will view as barbarous the age when people were expected to take frightening risks with their irreplaceable existences just to make it to the office every morning. We will see the attempt to manually operate a vehicle as a foolish and reckless gamble with one's life, unless one is a professional stunt driver who would earn millions in whatever future currency will then exist. But living longer will accomplish more than just a changed perspective toward the risks presently within our awareness. Because of our expanded scope of personal interest, we will begin to be increasingly aware of catastrophes that occur at much longer intervals than human lifespans have occupied to date. The impacts of major earthquakes and volcano eruptions, recurring ice ages, meteor strikes, and continental drift will begin to become everyday concerns, with far more individuals devoting their time, money, and attention to developing technological solutions to these hitherto larger-than-human-scale catastrophes. With even more radically lengthened lifespans, humans will be motivated to direct their efforts, including the full thrust of scientific research, toward overcoming the demise of entire solar systems. In the meantime, there would be less tolerance for any pollution that could undermine life expectancies or the long-term sustainability of a technological infrastructure, which, of course, would be necessary for life extension treatments to continue keeping senescence at bay. Thus, a society of radical life extension will embrace market-generated, environmentally friendly technologies, including cleaner energy sources, reuse of raw materials, for instance as base matter for 3D printing and nanoscale fabrication, and efficient targeting of resources toward their intended purposes, for instance avoidance of wasted water and sprinkler systems or wasted paper in the office. When life is long and good, humans move up on the hierarchy of needs. Not starving today ceases to be a worry, as does not getting murdered tomorrow. The true creativity of human faculties can then be directed toward addressing the grand, far more interesting and technologically demanding challenges of our existence on this earth. Some might worry that increased aversion to physical risk would dampen human creativity and discourage people from undertaking the kinds of ambitious and audacious projects that are needed for technological breakthroughs to emerge and spread. However, aversion to physical risk does not entail aversion to other kinds of risk, social, economic, or political. Indeed, social rejection
or financial ruin are not nearly as damaging to a person with millennia ahead of him as they are to a person with just a few decades of life left. A person who tries to run an innovative business and fails can spend a few decades earning back the capital needed to start again. Today, few entrepreneurs have that second chance. Most do not even have a first chance, as the initial capital needed for a groundbreaking enterprise is often colossal. Promising ideas and a meritorious character do not guarantee one a wealthy birth, and thus, even the best innovators must often start with borrowed funds, a situation that gives them little room to explore the possibilities and amplifies their ruin if they fail. The long-lived entrepreneurs in a world of indefinite life extension would tend to earn their own money up front and gradually go into business for themselves as they obtain the personal resources to do so. This kind of steady, sustainable entry into a line of work allows for a multitude of iterations and experiments that maximize the probability of a breakthrough. Alongside the direct benefits of living longer and the indirect benefits of the virtues cultivated thereby, indefinite life extension will also produce less stressful lives for most. The less probability there is of dying or becoming seriously injured or ill, the easier one can breathe as one pursues day-to-day endeavors of self-improvement, enjoyment, and productive work. The less likely a failure is to rob one of opportunities forever, the more likely humans will be to pursue the method of iterative learning and to discover new insights and improve technologies through a beneficent trial and error process whose worst downsides will have been curtailed through technology and ethics. Life extension will lead us to avoid and eliminate the risks that should not exist, while enabling us to safely pursue the risks that could benefit us if approached properly. Thank you very much. Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. When we seek indefinite life, what is it that we are fundamentally seeking to preserve? I begin by observing that I perceive the world as myself, Gennady Stolyarov II, and not as any other person. That is, while I may be able to envision another person's perspective, I cannot directly assume another person's physical sensations and thoughts. I cannot become another person. At the same time, my own sensations and thoughts, as I experience them directly, are what constitute my being, or, since being is too general a term, my I-ness. Consider what would happen if a scientist discovered a way to reconstruct, atom by atom, an identical copy of my body, with all of its physical structures and their interrelationships exactly replicating my present condition. If thereafter I continued to exist alongside this new individual, call him GS22, GS Roman numeral 2 dash Arabic numeral 2, it would be clear that he and I would not be the same person. While he would have memories of my past as I experienced it, if he chose to recall those memories, I would not be experiencing his recollection. Moreover, going forward, he would be able to think different thoughts and undertake different actions than the ones I might choose to pursue. I would not be able to directly experience whatever he chose to experience or whatever he experiences involuntarily. He would not have my I-ness, which would remain mine only. Now, suppose that instead of GS22 being my contemporary, he was created in some dystopian future where I had already died of some misfortune or another, but someone found a way to reconstruct the latest healthy state of my body, including my mind, atom for atom. The situation with regard to preservation of myself would not change. GS22 would be able to live as if he had my past knowledge and experiences, but my I-ness would still be gone. It would not transfer to him simply because the original Gennady Stolyarov II had died. Indeed, the I who had died would never be aware in any manner of GS22's existence, or any experiences that he might have in this future time. What is then this I-ness which can be preserved through some transformations and not through others? For instance, it is true that every atom comprising one's body now is not the same as the corresponding atom that comprised one's body 7 years ago. Nonetheless, if one remains alive, one's I-ness is clearly preserved. How can that be? It is so because the replacement does not occur all at once. Rather, at any given time, only a small fraction of the atoms in one's body are being replaced as old cells and their components take in energy, replicate, die, and are replaced by others. Thus, the continuity of bodily processes is preserved even as their physical components are constantly circulating into and out of the body. The mind is essentially a process made possible by the interactions of the brain and the remainder of the nervous system with the rest of the body. One's I-ness, being a product of the mind, is therefore reliant on the physical continuity of bodily processes, though not necessarily an unbroken continuity of higher consciousness. This can shed some light on which situations would allow for the preservation of one's I-ness and which would not. First, I will discuss the situations that do allow for the preservation of I-ness. Sleep. Sleep is often not even a suspension of consciousness. Dreams, for instance, are cases of the consciousness turning in on itself, examining and remixing data that have already been absorbed from the external world. Deep, dreamless sleep, where the passage of time is not noticed by the sleeper, also does not involve a cessation of bodily activity, and certain subconscious areas of the brain continue to work during it as well. General anesthesia. General anesthesia induces a temporary, completely unconscious state in a patient, but it does not shut down the body completely. Essential mechanisms, including the heart, continue to operate. Consciousness that is suspended and then revived, with the other bodily processes having remained continuous in the meantime, will not become an entirely different consciousness with a different I-ness, but will rather preserve its previous I-ness. Having previously been under general anesthesia, I can say with certainty that my I-ness had not been terminated in the process. Comas and vegetative states. During a coma, or a vegetative state, basic, largely involuntary bodily processes continue to function. If full functionality of the brain is eventually restored, the underlying system in which the I-ness emerges would still have functioned uninterrupted in the meantime. Some recovered coma patients, however, have also reported being aware of their surroundings during the coma, suggesting that aspects of higher consciousness can also be preserved without interruption in such a condition. Rescues from the brink of death. Situations where individuals have had close brushes with death may involve cessation of functionality for some bodily systems, but not for all. At least with current technology, the affected systems can only be restarted because some of the body's systems have not yet completely failed. This means that nothing about such experiences would preclude the continuity of one's I-ness. Incremental organ replacement. An artificial organ that is incorporated into a functioning body system will not disrupt the continuity of that system. Before, during, and after the transplant, the body continues to execute numerous important functions, and the new organ, provided that the transplant is accepted by the body, becomes just a new part of the same continuous system. As with atoms all being replaced over time, it is at least conceivable that via a series of gradual replacements, all of a person's organs, including the brain, could be exchanged for artificial varieties without disrupting the continuity of that person's integrity. This, of course, would only be the case provided that the organs were replaced one or a few at a time. With replacing the brain in this fashion, particular care would need to be taken to ensure that the replacement is not a situation of simply taking out the existing brain and putting a new one in its place. Rather, the new brain would need to start as an addendum to the existing brain, so that the existing brain could integrate its contents with the new brain before parts of the existing brain, for instance a physically diseased or irreparably damaged brain, are taken out of commission. If a gradual replacement is performed, it might even be possible for an individual to eventually have a fully electronic brain that still preserves that individual's I-ness. Now I will discuss situations that would not preserve I-ness. Reanimation after full death. Suppose instead of creating an identical atom-for-atom replica of a dead individual, that individual's fully dead corpse were instead exhumed and rehabilitated by restoring all bodily systems to a functional level and in configurations exactly replicating the dead individual's last healthy state. While here the individual's actual body would be worked on, in terms of the preservation of I-ness, this situation is no different from the case of a perfect replica of a deceased person having been made from scratch. The reanimated individual would possess the knowledge and memories of the dead individual, but the dead individual would not be aware of the reanimated individual's existence and would not experience the reanimated individual's subsequent interactions with the world. There may, of course, be tremendous value for others in reanimating already dead people, as the reanimated individual's personalities and mental states, shaped by the dead individual's actual past, which the reanimated individual would perceive the illusion of having experienced, could be invaluable in improving the world. Moreover, the reanimated individuals would certainly be happy to be alive, and would be as fully human and entitled to the same rights as would have been the dead individuals on whom they were modeled. However, while the reanimation of already dead people would be a fascinating breakthrough, it would do nothing for preserving the I-nesses of those who had already died. With practices such as cryonics, where the hope is to eventually reanimate currently clinically dead individuals by placing their bodies in biological stasis in the meantime, the issue of whether I-ness could be preserved is a bit more challenging to address. Cryonics relies on the premise that the current definition of death, based on what situations of bodily decay today's medicine would be able to reverse, would not be the same as the definition of death prevalent in the future, when many more conditions would hopefully be reversible. If an individual who is clinically dead by today's definition, but would not be dead by a future definition, is frozen today in a particular condition, the hope is that future technologies would, even by their routine application, be able to revive that person. However, in order to accomplish the preservation of the body up to that time, cryonics relies on suspending the physical processes within the body as much as possible. If these processes were not suspended, then their natural operation would lead to further decay of the body to the point where it might be extremely difficult or impossible to recover even using future technologies. While the cryonically preserved individual is not fully dead, at least not under a future definition, it is not clear what the implications of putting an entire body, including all physical systems, not just some, in stasis and later reanimating that same body would be for the preservation of I-ness. Moreover, I can only speculate as to whether cryonic preservation would still involve some extremely low-key, uninterrupted functioning of bodily systems, or whether it would require a complete shutdown of all systems. In the latter case, a cessation of I-ness would appear to be much more likely than in the former. Another situation
that would not preserve I-ness, at least in many scenarios where it is commonly portrayed, is the so-called uploading of consciousness. Particular caution should be taken with regard to any proposals to upload an individual's mind, personality, or memories onto a computer or an internet-like network. I can conceive of ways where such uploading might be safe with regard to not disrupting an existing I-ness, but I strongly doubt that the uploaded consciousness could serve as itself a perpetuator of the same I-ness. Assuming that it would become possible to encode all the information in a person's brain in a similar manner as files can be written to a portable drive and then copied to a computer, this would only create a copy of mental configurations. That copy might even have advanced interactive functionality, but it would not and could not replace the person of whose mind the copy was made. This situation might even be compared to the simultaneous existence of an individual and an identical replica of that individual in the body. Just as these two people would have two different I-nesses, so would the original bodily consciousness of the individual whose mind had been uploaded have a different I-ness from the I-ness of the uploaded mind, and I do not rule out the possibility of a non-organic entity of sufficient complexity being self-aware. The uploading situation I described is similar to making an interactive archive of one's mind, which might, in its more advanced implementations, also be self-aware. I recognize numerous potential benefits to such an approach, provided that it does not destroy or presume to replace the bodily mind which is being uploaded. The much more dangerous version of the uploading ambition perceives the uploading as a sort of migration of the consciousness from a corporeal, be it organic or inorganic environment, to a virtual environment. Any cessation of the corporeal person's bodily processes as a consequence of such a migration would destroy that person's I-ness, just as dying and having a bodily replica of oneself built afterward would. It would be tragic indeed if people for whom indefinite self-preservation is the foremost goal inadvertently destroyed the essential vantage point that they have in the attempt to perpetuate it. Another scenario that would not preserve I-ness, at least as it's often conceived, is the so-called merging of consciousness. Some futurists have expressed the desire to eventually connect multiple individuals' consciousnesses via electronic means, much as computers can be connected to one another. Such connections are supposed to facilitate individuals' abilities to sense directly the experiences of the other individuals to whom their minds are connected. But such an undertaking, depending on how it is implemented, may also have destructive effects with regard to the I-nesses of the individuals being connected. I can conceive of two qualitatively different scenarios where individual consciousnesses might be connected. Scenario 1 would appear to be innocuous. To understand how it might work, suppose that it became possible to upload copies of an individual's thoughts and experiences onto a portable medium, much as one might upload a file from a computer onto a portable drive without destroying the original file. If it becomes possible to directly convey thoughts and experiences in an electronic medium, then such copying and transfer from one mind to another might also become possible. Taken one step beyond, a portable medium that can be plugged into, in a manner of speaking, one conscious system, and then transported to another, one might envision a more continuous mechanism for doing so, similar to a wireless internet connection over which information is transferred. But it is important to recognize that while this linkage might enable mind X to experience what mind Y experiences, the two experience sets would still be perceived by the separate I-nesses of mind X and mind Y. If mind Y obtained the experiences of mind X, and mind X were to be physically destroyed, the I-ness of X would not be transferred to Y. This scenario has a parallel in currently available technologies such as explorer robots, which have entered narrow shafts in Egyptian pyramids and traversed the surface of Mars, sending back continuous live images of what their cameras recorded. These images enable a human observer to experience the environment of the robot without being in that environment. However, if that robot were instead a conscious being, the transmission of images and even other sensory stimuli from this being would not equate to an extension of the being's I-ness to the observer. This scenario would presumably allow for each individual participating in the sharing of information to select which information to share or to keep to oneself, much as a computer connected to the internet does not need to share all of the files on it with other computers in the network. However, another scenario, call it scenario 2 with regard to merging consciousnesses, could not avoid destroying the I-nesses of those involved. This scenario would constitute a complete merger, where the aim is for every consciousness to be able to directly assume the vantage point of every other and to control the actions of the others directly, without any meaningful separation possible among the minds involved. If two I-nesses were to merge in this manner, then they would probably become a single I-ness based on the combined sensations of the previous I-nesses. But, just as mixing two fruits together in a blender and separating the results into two halves would not yield the original fruits, neither would combining two I-nesses and then separating them, assuming this would be technically feasible, result in the original I-nesses. At best, there would be two hybrid I-nesses, in a manner of speaking, and at worst, no I-nesses at all, because the new combined I-ness might be destroyed by division, just as the I-ness of every biological individual today would be eliminated via any attempt to split it into components. Every human observation and experience to date suggests that the human individual is the basic unit of rational conscious activity, and that physically separating the mind into subcomponents destroys the emergent system of rational consciousness. If the desire is to preserve the individuality of each person, which necessarily implies preserving that person's self-awareness and vantage point as directly experienced by that person, then the kind of merging involved in scenario 2 should be avoided as contrary to that aim. However, the file sharing situation of scenario 1, where each I-ness remains compartmentalized within the individual and experiences are only shared at each individual's discretion, might be a useful, and if safety precautions are taken, harmless future means of extremely direct communication. So where does this discussion leave the advocates of literal, as opposed to figurative, immortality, who are interested in preserving the actual I-ness of each individual, as opposed to simply a memory or record of that individual, however complete and interactive, or creating a functional replica of that individual in the future? Two general conclusions can be drawn, which, while they may be considered somewhat grim, can guide the quest for genuine immortality. Number 1, there is no way to resurrect the I-ness of a fully dead individual. Number 2, there is no way to preserve the I-ness of an individual without preserving the spatiotemporal continuity of that individual's physical body, allowing for incremental modifications to that body. Facing uncomfortable truths can indeed be a prerequisite to genuine life-reinforcing progress. The conclusions above do indeed suggest that the quest for indefinite life is more difficult than some might have thought, as only the preservation of the uninterrupted functioning of an individual's body could bring it about. Individuals who have already fully died, leaving aside the ambiguities and uncertainties entailed in cryonic preservation, have unfortunately already irreversibly lost their I-nesses, though it is still conceivable that future technologies will render their past experiences of immense benefit to others. The focus of life extension should therefore be the elimination of disease and senescence, the repair of the body, and its gradual, piecewise augmentation via biotechnology, nanotechnology, and electronic technology. The result of such endeavors could in fact be compatible with some of the projections of futurists like Ray Kurzweil, who envision a world where human consciousness is improved via electronic means to be orders of magnitude more powerful than it is today, provided that the underlying system that facilitates the I-ness is preserved as a separate system and allowed to function continuously amid a sequence of incremental improvements. There is no reason why human faculties and durability could not be enhanced without bound. We who are still alive can still reap the fruits of potentially limitless future progress if we manage to survive to see the breakthroughs. Thank you very much. Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. In what is perhaps the most absurd attack on transhumanism to date, Mike Adams of naturalnews.com equates this broad philosophy and movement with, quote, the entire idea that you can upload your mind to a computer, and further posits that the only kind of possible mind uploading is the destructive kind, where the original biological organism ceases to exist. Adams goes so far as calling transhumanism a, quote, death cult, much like the infamous Heaven's Gate cult led by Marshall Applewhite. I will not devote this essay to refuting any of Adams's arguments against destructive mind uploading, because no serious transhumanist thinker of whom I am aware endorses the kind of procedure Adams uses as a straw man. For anyone who wishes to continue existing as an individual, uploading the contents of the mind to a computer and then killing the body is perhaps the most bizarrely counterproductive possible activity, short of old-fashioned suicide. Instead, Adams's article, all the misrepresentations aside, offers the opportunity to make important distinctions of value to transhumanists. First, having a positive view of mind uploading is neither necessary nor sufficient for being a transhumanist. Mind uploading has been posited as one of several routes toward indefinite human life extension. Other routes include the periodic repair of the existing biological organism, as outlined in Aubrey de Grey's SENS project, or as entailed in the concept of nanomedicine, and the augmentation of the biological organism with non-biological components. Ray Kurzweil's actual view, as opposed to the absurd positions Adams attributes to him. Transhumanism, as a philosophy and a movement, embraces the lifting of the present limitations upon the human condition, limitations that arise out of the failures of human biology and unaltered physical nature. Max More, in his essay, Transhumanism Towards a Futurist Philosophy, writes that, quote, transhumanism differs from humanism in recognizing and anticipating the radical alterations in the nature and possibilities of our lives, resulting from various sciences and technologies, such as neuroscience and neuropharmacology, life extension, nanotechnology, artificial ultra-intelligence, and space habitation, combined with a rational philosophy and value system. That Adams would take this immensity of interrelated concepts, techniques, and aspirations, and equate it to destructive mind uploading, is, plainly put, mind-boggling. There is ample room in transhumanism for a variety of approaches toward lifting the limitations of the human condition. Some of these approaches will be more successful than others, and no one approach is obligatory for those wishing to consider themselves transhumanists. Moreover, Adams greatly misconstrues the positions of those transhumanists who do support mind uploading. For most such transhumanists, a digital existence is not seen as superior to their current biological existences, but rather as a necessary recourse if or when it becomes impossible to continue maintaining a biological existence. Dmitry Itskov's 2045 initiative is perhaps the most prominent example of the pursuit of mind uploading today. The aim of the initiative is to achieve cybernetic immortality in a stepwise fashion. through the creation of a sequence of avatars that gives the biological human an increasing amount of control over non-biological components. Avatar B, planned for circa 2020 to 2025, would involve a human brain controlling an artificial body. If successful, this avatar would prolong the existence of the biological brain when other components of the biological body have become too irreversibly damaged to support it. Avatar C, planned for circa 2030 to 2035, would involve the transfer of a human mind from a biological to a cybernetic brain after the biological brain is no longer able to support life processes. There is no destruction intended in the 2045 Avatar Project milestones, only preservation of some manner of intelligent functioning of a person whom the status quo would instead relegate to becoming food for worms. The choice between decomposition and any kind of avatar is a no-brainer. Well, a brainer, actually, for those who choose the latter. Is Itskov's path toward immortality the best one? I personally prefer SENS, combined with nanomedicine and piecewise artificial augmentations of the sort that are already beginning to occur. Witness the amazing B-Bionic 3 prosthetic hand. Itskov's approach appears to assume that the technology for transferring the human mind to an entirely non-biological body will become available sooner than the technology for incrementally maintaining and fortifying the biological body to enable its indefinite continuation. My estimation is the reverse. Before scientists will be able to reverse engineer not just the outward functions of a human brain, but also its immensely complex and intricate internal structure, we will have within our grasp the ability to conquer an ever greater number of perils that befall the biological body, and to repair the body using both biological and non-biological components. The biggest hurdle for mind uploading to overcome is one that does not arise with the approach of maintaining the existing body and incrementally replacing defective components. This hurdle is the preservation of the individual's unique and irreplaceable vantage point upon the world, his or her direct sense of being that person and no other. I term this direct vantage point an individual's I-ness. Franco Cortese, in his immensely rigorous and detailed conceptual writings on the subject, calls it subjective continuity, and devotes his attention to techniques that could achieve gradual replacement of biological neurons with artificial neurons in such a way that there is never a temporal or operational disconnect between the biological mind and its later cybernetic instantiation. Could the project of mind uploading pursue directions that would achieve the preservation of the I-ness of the biological person? I think this may be possible, but only if the resulting cybernetic mind is structurally analogous to the biological mind and furthermore maintains the temporal continuity of processes exhibited by an analog system, as opposed to a digital system's discrete on-off states and the inability to perform multiple exactly simultaneous operations. Furthermore, only by developing the gradual replacement approaches explored by Cortese could this project of continuing the same subjective experience, as opposed to simply creating a copy of the individual, be realized. But Adams, in his screed against mind uploading, seems to ignore all of these distinctions and explorations. Indeed, he appears to be oblivious to the fact that, yes, transhumanists have thought quite a bit about the philosophical questions involved in mind uploading. He seems to think that in mind uploading you simply, quote, copy the brain and paste it somewhere else and hope that, quote, somehow magically that other thing becomes you. Again, no serious proponent of mind uploading, and more generally, no serious thinker who has considered the subject, would hold this misconception. Adams is wrong on a still further level, though. Not only is he wrong to equate transhumanism with mind uploading, not only is he wrong to declare all mind uploading to be destructive, he is also wrong to condemn the type of procedure that would simply make a non-destructive copy of an individual. This type of so-called backup creation has indeed been advocated by transhumanists such as Ray Kurzweil. While a pure copy of one's mind or its contents would not transfer one's I-ness to a digital substrate and would not enable one to continue experiencing existence after a fatal illness or accident, it would certainly help an individual regain his memories in the event of brain damage or amnesia. Furthermore, if the biological individual were to irreversibly perish, such a copy would at least preserve vital information about the biological individual for the benefit of others. Furthermore, it could enable the biological individual's influence upon the world to be more powerfully actualized by a copy that considers itself to have the biological individual's memories, background, knowledge, and personality. If we had with us today copies of the minds of Archimedes, Benjamin Franklin, and Nikola Tesla, we would certainly all benefit greatly from continued outpourings of technological and philosophical innovation. The original geniuses would not know or care about this since they would still be dead, but we, in our interactions with minds very much like theirs, would be immensely better off than we are with only their writings and past inventions at our disposal. Yes, destructive digital copying of a mind would be a bafflingly absurd and morally troubling undertaking. But recognition of this is neither a criticism of transhumanism nor of any genuine, promising projects of mind uploading. Instead, it is simply a matter of common sense, a quality which Mike Adams would do well to acquire. Thank you very much.
Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. Today I am going to answer two questions that were posed to me by Michael Garfield in the comments to my video, Eliminating Death, Part 1, Death as Waste. Mr. Garfield writes, Gennady, how would you respond to these observations from an evolutionary biologist and fellow fan of futurist speculation? His first observation is, quote, evolution as we understand it requires death. Creation and destruction are only two aspects of the same thing. Death and change are inseparable. Well, my response to this first observation is that I completely disagree with every statement other than the first. And with regard to the first statement, evolution as it has occurred through natural selection does involve death, in the sense that an individual organism doesn't evolve. Evolution occurs on a species level across many, many generations. However, that does not imply in any way that evolution is somehow normatively desirable, something that should be advanced by us as individuals and seen as moral from the standpoint of us as individuals. In fact, evolution is one of the cruelest, most appallingly wasteful processes. An important fact is 99.9% of all species that have ever existed are now extinct. Furthermore, evolution offers no protections to the individual, no guarantees that an individual who is more meritorious, either in terms of any sorts of innate abilities or in terms of what that individual has actually accomplished in the world, is actually going to survive. That individual could trip on a rock, fall, and die, even if, under all other objective standards, that individual would have been fitter in an evolutionary sense. But morality, fundamentally, exists at a much higher level than evolution. It exists at the level of a rational, thinking, volitionally conscious individual being. Morality doesn't begin with rocks, it doesn't begin with plants, it doesn't begin with worms. It begins with creatures who can think in a moral sense, who can ask the question, what should I do? And realize that the answer to that question presupposes the continuation of that creature's life, because without the continuation of one's life, one cannot keep answering that question, what should I do? I have a 2-part video series on this called Life as the Origin and Basis of Morality, which I recommend that everyone, including Mr. Garfield, watch. But morality starts with the individual. Evolution is a phenomenon that occurs within species and across species as new species are formed through natural selection over many, many generations. There's nothing inherently progressive about evolution, though. Indeed, there have been many periods throughout the history of the Earth where more advanced species, think of the dinosaurs, have been wiped out by some cataclysm, and for a long time thereafter, less advanced species were the ones that were most prevalent, and eventually we emerged, but there was nothing written in any sort of cosmic law saying that all evolution had to culminate with us, and that we, at present, just because we came about through the process of evolution, have to perpetuate that very same process in that very same way. Once human beings arrived on the scene, with their ability to reason, with their ability to think from a moral point of view, with their ability to respect every individual and not just see an individual as some sort of disposable tool for some vaguely defined greater good, we had the power, and we should use that power to change the prevailing rules by which life operates. We have already done that with many species. Some of them have benefited quite considerably from that. Think of domestic dogs and cats, and the tremendously better and longer lives that they lead because humans take care of them. But it has been the same with us. We, by utilizing technology, by utilizing reason, by utilizing science, and that includes not only the natural sciences, but also the sciences of man, what Ludwig von Mises, the great economist, would have called the sciences of human action. We have been able to create a better world, where we live about 5 times longer on average now than our Paleolithic ancestors have, and where we have the potential to live even longer, not only through biomedical interventions, but also through technologies that reduce the risk of physical accidents, that reduce social strife, including warfare and political oppression, and that enable us to treat one another more civilly and engage in more productive interactions than our ancestors have done. All of these are departures from biological evolution. Indeed, we are taking on the role of guiding evolution, as we have been for millennia. Ever since the first agricultural revolution, circa 10,000 BCE, human beings have been guiding the evolution of crops and domestic animals. Now, we have more refined tools. We can artificially create bacteria, for instance, that can perform a variety of useful functions, such as cleaning up toxic spills. We can genetically engineer foods to be more nutritious and have fewer toxic byproducts. And hopefully, in the near future, we will be able to genetically re-engineer our own bodies, as well as repair the damage that accumulates in our own bodies throughout life, in order to correct for the necessary flaws in the evolutionary outcome that has led to humans. Because, honestly, evolution is quite apathetic past a certain point. It is evolutionarily advantageous to have the traits that enable one to survive to reproductive age, and to reproduce, and maybe even to help rear one's grandchildren, which is why humans with their current genetic code can be as long-lived as they are. However, past a certain point, evolution doesn't care. Evolution is not a teleological force. It doesn't have any sort of benevolent motives whatsoever. And if evolution doesn't care about us, about the survival of each of us as individuals, why should we care about it, except insofar as it could be a useful instrument for us if we harness it and utilize it in a guided fashion to serve our objectives as thinking, volitionally conscious moral beings. So that was his first statement. I will also add my response that I do not believe that creation and destruction are two sides of the same coin, so to speak. They're diametrically opposite. Creation is the bringing of greater order out of disorder or chaos. Conservation of matter would lead us to think that we cannot bring the raw stuff of existence into being, but we can rearrange it. So a creative individual makes a more complex arrangement out of disorder, whereas destruction is the breaking down of that complex arrangement. Now, his second statement is, quote, people who do live to 80 plus years seem to develop an understanding of the world that allows them to welcome death as the fulfillment of one stage and the possible beginning of another, irrespective of their personal beliefs. I do not concur with that either. First of all, because I know that a supercentenarian in Japan who died in 2009, his name was Tomoji Tanabe, had stated when asked how long he wants to live that he would like to live indefinitely. And unfortunately, he only got to live to age 113. However, he made that statement at age 112, meaning that he was happy to keep on living even though he was quite senesced at that time. He still saw that life had a whole lot to offer and he didn't want to give it up. Another great example of an individual older than 80 who wanted to live indefinitely was Robert Ettinger, who is famous as being the pioneer of cryonics and the founder of the Cryonics Institute. This was a cause that he had championed throughout his life, and true to his principles, when he died in 2011, he asked to be cryopreserved, and he was. So, hopefully, if his premises are correct, and if the procedure that preserved him would also have preserved his I-ness, or as some would call it, his subjective continuity after he is reanimated at some hypothetical future time, hopefully he will have the fulfillment of his wish and will live on in the future. But those are two great examples of people past the age of 80 who wanted to live a lot longer without limit. Even Benjamin Franklin back in the 18th century was a proto-transhumanist and life extensionist. He wrote about the desirability of conquering disease and senescence, and he had a very poignant passage where he regretted that he might have been born too soon to benefit from these technological advances. So let's hope that we are not born too soon, and let's hope that our ambitions extend to indefinite longevity, even if and when we reach that threshold of 80 years. I don't think all people fall into the category of thinking that Mr. Garfield describes, and if some do, I can find a plausible explanation for that. It is that these individuals may have experienced severe health problems. They're not as energetic as they used to be. They don't have the same abilities to accomplish, and perhaps there's a measure of regret within them for that. Perhaps they think it might be better to get it over with. And that's very sad. It's very tragic. If they see death as some sort of next stage, then there's absolutely no scientific basis for it. There's absolutely no reason to believe that from an individual's vantage point, anything continues after death. The theists will often posit that there's some sort of afterlife, some sort of existence of an immaterial soul, again, assuming that existence on faith without any sort of empirical or rational evidence to back it up. However, for someone who doesn't have that theistic belief, to posit that death is some sort of next stage is, I'm afraid, wishful thinking. It may be wishful thinking that some people will readily engage in as a way to rationalize what they would perceive to be an otherwise futile situation, especially if they don't believe that any sort of way out of that situation is feasible, any sort of sustainable life extension which would require the reversal of senescence and frailty. So those are my responses to Mr. Michael Garfield. I do not think that there is any normative value in evolution. I do not think that creation requires destruction. And I do not think that people older than the age of 80 will necessarily show a resigned acceptance of death or an eager acceptance of death or a philosophical, calm acceptance of death. None of that is necessary. I think every human life, as an individual life, has inherent value. As long as a person is an innocent person who has not gravely harmed other human beings, that person is worthy of continued life. And hopefully the advent of improved medical technologies will enable more and more people of every age group to fulfill that ambition. Thank you very much.